Welcome. In this lecture, we're going to talk about religious dualism. As human beings, all we can really do is think dualistically. Every concept we're capable of thinking about is only a thing because it's not everything. We cannot think about a ultimate reality that is monistic, that is all one thing. Thinking, by definition, is identifying different concepts and comparing them with each other. So when we think about a monistic ultimate reality, we're thinking about something that truly is transcendent, beyond our ability to comprehend. We're going to talk a lot more about that when we get to Hinduism, so don't worry too much about it for now. I only introduce with that because we're going to talk about conceptions of ultimate reality or ultimate world construction, if you want to think about it this way. And we're going to call these different kinds of dualisms. Now, the best way to explain this is to start off with something most of you are going to be very familiar with, and this is good and evil dualism. This is the kind of dualism we find in monotheism, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and there are other symbolic constructions, such as light versus the darkness, or the truth versus the lie, heaven versus hell, God versus Satan, angels versus demons, and so on. The idea is here, with a idea of a cosmic good and evil dualism, there is a cosmic battle between good and evil going on all the time. Now, this kind of thinking is unique to monotheism, and this is important to remember. Monotheism has only been around about 2,600 years. In the next lecture on theisms, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and we'll talk a lot more about it when we get to the Axial Age lecture. But for now, suffice to say that monotheism is the first kind of theism, the first kind of religious belief that conceives of the ultimate reality as involving a battle of good against evil. You might think of it as one God who has a detractor, a nemesis, a Satan, a rebel, if you will, who has an army who is fighting God's army. And everything that is wrong in the world, injustice, suffering, the things that happen to you in your life that you don't deserve. If you happen to be a monotheist and you happen to find meaning in this dualism, you might actually interpret things happening in your life according to it. For instance, if you're trying to do well and trying to do good, and it seems like all kinds of powers come against you trying to thwart your progress, you might think that evil is somehow fighting against you. Or if something unfair happens, you might think of it as just kind of like the inevitable mystery of evil present in the world. Now, this is not the only thing that brings you a little bit of comfort because you feel like you're part of something larger, but the ultimate outcome is what people hope for. Another aspect of the monotheistic religions that believe in this cosmic battle between good and evil is they believe in a time called the eschaton. This is a fancy word for the last days or the end times, where there is supposed to come a final battle between good and evil, and good will one day be victorious. And after this, there will be a new world, or a renewed world. There's different conceptions of this, where it will be more of an ideal existence. You're not going to have this kind of injustice and suffering as a result of evil. And again, this is, we call these eschatological religions because they believe in this last days battle between good and evil. Now, if you happen to be one of those people that think that you're actually going into the last days right now, or you're in the middle of them, you're certainly eschatological, but there's another term that applies, and that is apocalyptic. Apocalypse is a term we use for revelation of the eschaton. If someone is apocalyptic, they believe that they are seeing the signs that the last days are being revealed now. We're either in them or they're imminent. We're getting ready to go into them. And there have been many communities in the last, over 2,000 years that have believed that they were in the last generation and they were going to see the last battle between good and evil on earth. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well later on. Suffice to say for right now that this is the kind of dualism that we see in the monotheistic religions. However, there's a couple other kind of dualisms I want to present just so you have something to compare that which you are most familiar with too. First, let's talk about spirit-matter dualism. Now, it's important for me to tell you that spirit-matter dualism is not a feature in any of the world religions today. It actually had its heyday, being very, very general here, from about 2,500 years ago to about 1,500 years ago. So why is it so important? It's so important because a lot of the religions today responded to these kind of teachings. And especially in Christianity, these kind of teachings were rejected by the early community of Christians, and it was the first major doctrinal controversy in early Christianity. In fact, it happened so early that one of Jesus' apostles, John, actually writes about this heresy in 2 different places in his writings in the New Testament. Now, this is not what it was called back then, but today we have a term that we have coined for many movements like this. You can call them philosophical religions or religious philosophies, pick your adjective. But one thing they all had in common is that spirit was good and matter was evil. They believed that salvation involved a revelation of higher knowledge. The Greek word for knowledge is gnosis. It starts with a silent G, so it looks like gnosis, but it's gnosis. And it is from this root word that we came up with the term Gnosticism to refer to any of these movements, again, that have certain things in common. One being that spirit is good and all matter is evil. The world is evil, the chair you're sitting on is evil, the clothes you're wearing are evil, the body that you're imprisoned in is evil. There are many different kinds of Gnosticism, but something else that they have in common is that they tend to believe that this physical world was created by a lesser power, a lesser deity. Some forms of Gnosticism call this being the evil demiurgos. And one of the common creation stories, if you will, generally put, is that we were all spirit children of the Spirit Father. But this lesser deity, this evil God, created the physical world, created our physical bodies, and imprisoned us, the spirit children, in these physical bodies, in this physical world, so we would forget who and what we were. And learning to treat this material world as the real world, and learning to think of ourselves as these material beings that we've become, we will be destroyed, which is what happens to every flesh and bone creature. So this God is not your friend. This God is trying to destroy us, according to Gnosticism. And so when the Gnostics have this infusion of pure spiritual knowledge, if you will, this gnosis, this is when they realize for the first time that they are purely spiritual beings. And from this point on, although there's different ways of reacting to this new revelation in different forms of Gnosticism, one thing is similar, and that is they want to identify with their spiritual being. They do not want to identify with their fleshly or their material being anymore. And their hope is that if they can cease to think of themselves as these material beings and identify with the spiritual beings they are, their hope is that when they die and their body is put in the ground to rot, that their spirit will be set free and can go back to the Spirit Father to be with the Spirit Father forever in the state they were in before this world. However, most of these Gnostic type philosophies or religions do not believe the majority of the people are going to have this opportunity. They believe they're kind of a chosen few that see the truth. So it is a bit of a exclusive community. And one of the things that they really like is they like riddles, cryptic sayings, parables, and so on, that only they really understand because, of course, they have this secret gnosis, this spiritual knowledge. And it is because of this that there are a couple different groups of Gnostics, at least, that become very enamored with the teachings of Jesus. Now, you may know that Jesus taught often in parables, and some of these parables were a little bit tricky to understand. In fact, he has to give his disciples special guidance to understand what some of these parables mean so that then they can teach other people correctly. Anyway, what the Gnostics have done is they've taken Jesus' teachings and they have kind of changed the interpretation of a lot of these riddles and parables, at least changed it from the interpretation that Jesus' first generation of disciples the ones that were taught by him, believe that these parables meant. And they have changed the interpretation of these parables to correlate with their views on spirit, matter, and the nature of the world, and the nature of spirit being good and matter being evil. And it seems from all of the earliest records that the early disciples did not buy into this at all. And of course, as I mentioned before, John is the one who is the most vocal against this in two places. In the Gospel of John, he is talking about, and this is an ancient concept in axial age Greek philosophy that really kind of catches on, and that is the idea of the logos, which it means actually a word or a communicative idea, but it comes to mean the creative power of God, the word by which God creates the world, and the sum total of everything God has communicated about himself. And in Christian theology, Jesus is syncretized with this idea of the logos. John, in the beginning of his gospel, the Gospel of John, talks about the logos. He says, in the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything was made by the Word. The word is logos. Now, this might sound kind of Gnostic to start with, but when you get down to verse 14 of chapter 1, John says, and the logos became flesh and dwelt among us. This is something that no Gnostic would agree with. That's one of the most anti-Gnostic things you can say, because Gnostics believe that flesh is evil. In fact, in the Gnostic idea of the Son of God coming to earth, they don't believe that Jesus was really a physical being, because if he was, he would have been evil. So it seems like there are two different views on this. There seems to be a group of Gnostics that believe that Jesus kind of tweaked with your senses, so that you saw him and heard him, and if you touched him, I mean, it felt like he was physical, but again, he's kind of tweaking your senses so he can communicate with you, but he's not really there in a physical sense, so he isn't evil, isn't connected with the evil. There seems to be another form of Gnosticism that believes that the Son of God has kind of taken control of the body of this man, Jesus of Nazareth, and is using his body and faculties to communicate, but is not joined with him in a way where the Son of God actually contacts and is polluted by the evil of being physical. In any case, neither of these groups believe that Jesus was a physical person. Certainly none of them believe, none of them are hoping for a resurrection where you get your physical body back. And this is basic Christianity, that Jesus was born of a physical woman, was a physical man, suffered great pain and humiliation, died, his dead body was put in the grave, and that body came out of the grave, and 40 days later ascended to heaven. Now these are things that no Gnostic believes. And if you read the Apostles' Creed, it seems like the entire thing was crafted to refute Gnosticism. It stresses every single point about Jesus being a physical person. Now this brings me back to John again. I mentioned in two places in the New Testament he speaks against Gnosticism. The second is in one of the letters he wrote. We call it 1 John. It's the first of three. It's the longest one. And apparently there's been a split in the churches that John is overseeing, and John has written kind of a general letter, we call it an epistle, to explain to people exactly what has happened. And he says, hereby know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. Everyone that believes that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God. And everyone who does not believe this is not of God. And in the same context, he talks about the spirit of Antichrist in the world. And suffice to say, he could not have condemned this teaching much more strongly than he does. So we see that this dispute, this doctrinal heresy, is already taking off in the days when the New Testament is actually being written, long before the books are compiled and ever called the New Testament. So this is the earliest heresy in early Christianity. If you haven't already put it together, another one of the implications is that Jesus was not the son of the God of the Old Testament. Because remember, the God of the Old Testament created the world. Of course, when that God created the world, he said the world was good. Well, Gnostics don't believe that. They believe that the physical world was evil, and they believe the God that created the physical world was not the high God, was not the spirit God, was not the Father of Jesus, but was the evil God, the lower God, the evil demiurgos. and they believe that Jesus came to undo the evil works of this lesser deity. So for many reasons like this, obviously the classic understanding of Jesus having to suffer and die as a sacrifice for sin is completely incompatible with these Gnostic teachings. And they do hang on for a while. There's actually, a couple centuries later, a big group led by a guy named Marcion that specifically teaches this, that the God of the Old Testament is actually not God, but is actually the evil detractor. But again, from about the 5th century CE, you just don't really hear much about these teachings anymore, and they're not present in any one of the world religions today. But I've presented this in some detail because it is important if you want to understand the history of Christianity, and it's also important because I'm giving you something, another way of looking at the world that you can kind of compare good and evil dualism with. A third form that we want to talk about, and we're going to talk a lot more about this when we talk about Chinese religions, and it is present in the world today and is very influential in the Far East, and that is the dualism of complementary opposites. You have probably heard of yin and yang. You may have heard it just kind of almost as a little slogan or something. Maybe you've seen the little diagram where you have a circle and half of it is black and half of it is white. But even in the black section, there's a little dot of white, and in the white section, there's a little dot of black, because there's always a little bit of yin and yang and always a little bit of yang and yin. But the idea is that yang and yin, they're opposites, but they're complementary opposites. It's like they need each other. Each of them is the complementing balance to the other one. So unlike good and evil dualism, they're not trying to destroy each other. They're not in conflict. They're complementary opposites. Yin and yang we'll talk a lot more about in the future. But for now, let me just say a couple things. Of course, this is prevalent in the Far Eastern cultures and religions. And the easiest way to understand this, I'll give you a couple of analogies. One of them might be the difference between male and female. Let's assume that your ultimate concern, your ultimate goal was to reproduce, to have children. And that was your main focus. Well, to produce a human, you need a male and a female. If two males get married, they're going to need a surrogate. If two females get married, they're going to need a sperm donor. You must have a male and a female to create human life. And so it would be ridiculous to make some kind of a value judgment that one was better than the other when both of them are absolutely necessary. Another way to think about it would be as a battery. Think about your car battery, for instance. It's got two terminals. One is positive, one is negative. And if you were thinking in classic good and evil dualism fashion, you might think, oh, let's disconnect this negative cable, because it's evil and we don't want demons in our car. But if both cables aren't hooked up, your car doesn't run. There actually is a transfer of power from the positive to the negative, or what we call ground, or what they call in Britain earth. And this is kind of the way yang and yin work. It's usually yang is usually thought of as being the more assertive. The transfer of power is from yang to yin. And so, just like a battery, you would need both terminals non-corroded and well-connected so you can get the maximum flow of this energy. So in Chinese religions, we'll find that it's important to have a proper balance between yin and yang bearings. One of the examples of this is feng shui, you might have heard of. And by the way, it's much more than a 6-month course in interior design. There are people whose whole lives are patterned around feng shui principles of finding a balance between yin and yang bearings. Also, with proper yin and yang bearings, you get the maximum flow of this energy in all of the universe called qi. Ever heard of Tai Chi? Anyway, qi is something that you can appropriate more or less of, and obviously it's advantageous to appropriate more. So this is another form of dualism that we'll talk more about later that's prevalent, as I said, in the Far Eastern cultures and religions. This concludes our brief lecture on religious dualism, and we'll move on now to different kinds of theisms. I think you're going to find this one very interesting.